A very tall son named Barron.
The waitress smirked and made a rude joke about Barron Trump, not realizing he was the owner of the very restaurant she worked at. She laughed loudly, thinking everyone would agree with her, but she was moments away from a shocking humiliation. Her confidence was about to disappear as the truth came crashing down. What happens when someone mocks the wrong person in front of the wrong crowd? Tune in, because what happened next forced her to flee the country in the middle of the night. The waitress who picked the wrong guest. The restaurant oozed wealth, a place where elegance wasn't just expected, it was required. Among the perfectly dressed guests sat one man who blended in effortlessly, quiet but carrying an undeniable presence. He wasn't there to impress anyone, he simply wanted a meal in peace. But peace wasn't on the menu that night. The waitress, full of arrogance, decided this was her stage, and she had already picked her target. Before we even get into what happened next, one thing is clear. Her words were about to backfire in a way she never saw coming, and this wasn't going to be her only regret of the night. At first, she kept it subtle, just enough to make the nearby tables chuckle. But the laughter fed her ego, so she turned up the heat. With a smirk and a loud voice, she started throwing out cheap insults aimed at a certain former president, making sure the whole room heard. She thought she was in control, thought she had the crowd on her side, but arrogance has a price, and hers was about to be collected. She had no idea she had just chosen the worst possible person to mock. The mood in the restaurant started to shift. The amusement faded as some guests exchanged glances, sensing something was off. The tension in the air thickened with every passing second. The waitress, oblivious, kept going, too caught up in her moment. And then with a calmness that cut through the noise like a knife, Barron Trump spoke. His words weren't loud, but they carried more weight than anything she had just said. The whole room fell silent as every eye turned toward her, watching as her confidence crumbled in real time. Her smirk faded. This wasn't the reaction she expected. She thought she'd get more laughs, more approval, but instead she was met with something far worse: dead silence. And then came the moment that would haunt her. The man she had mocked revealed exactly who he was. Barron Trump, the owner of the very restaurant she worked in. The realization hit her like a truck. A murmur swept through the crowd, the weight of her mistake rippling across the room. The people who had laughed with her just moments ago now looked at her with disbelief and pity. She had made an unforgivable mistake and there was no undoing it. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but there wasn't one. Moments ago she had been so sure of herself, so confident that she controlled the room. Now she stood frozen, drowning in regret. From the corner of the room, the restaurant manager who had been watching the disaster unfold finally stepped forward. His face was unreadable, but his next move was clear. The waitress, who had been basking in her own arrogance, was about to face the consequences of her actions. Everything happened fast. The manager's voice was calm but firm, leaving no room for argument. This wasn't a warning, this was the end of the road. A light touch on her arm signaled what was coming next. One step, then another, and before she fully grasped what was happening, she was standing outside. The night air felt colder than it should have, but maybe that was just the sting of humiliation setting in. Her time at the restaurant was over. No discussion, no second chance. She had been so certain of her words, so sure she was untouchable, but in the end, all she did was talk herself out of a job. Inside, life went on like she had never existed. The sound of glasses clinking and quiet conversations picked up again, smoothing over the incident like a ripple fading on water. The same coworkers who had laughed with her just minutes ago now avoided her gaze. Some turned their backs, pretending to be busy. Others, who had once cheered her on, suddenly wanted nothing to do with her. She had been one of them, part of their world. Now she was nothing more than an outsider looking in. The guests, too, had already moved on. The tension, the drama, the swift downfall, it had all been a passing moment to them. They returned to their meals, their conversations, their lives as if she had never been there at all. And what about the man she mocked? He didn't smirk, didn't gloat, didn't even glance toward the door where she had disappeared. He simply carried on, eating his meal like nothing had happened. That, more than anything, made the weight of her mistake hit even harder. If he had shouted, if he had looked pleased, maybe she could have convinced herself that she wasn't completely defeated. Maybe she could have told herself she still had some control. But he did nothing. And in that silence, in that complete indifference, the truth became undeniable. She had made the wrong choice, and there was no way to take it back. She had underestimated the power of words, thought her sarcasm and wit would carry her, that her jokes were harmless fun. But respect isn't something you demand. It's something you give before you receive. She had crossed a line without realizing it, and now she had to live with the outcome. You never know who you're talking to. Sometimes the person you think you can humiliate is the one holding all the cards. And when you realize that too late, the damage is already done. For her, this was just the beginning of understanding how much a few careless words can cost. The impossible equation challenge. The classroom felt like a battlefield, everyone waiting for the first strike. Dr. Markham's glare was sharp as she took slow, deliberate steps toward the whiteboard, marker in hand. "All right, Mr. Trump," she said, voice dripping with challenge. "Since you have such strong opinions about mathematics, let's put that confidence to the test." The marker screeched against the board as she wrote, numbers and symbols piling up in a monstrous equation that stretched across the surface. A few students exchanged nervous glances, some even whispering. This wasn't just difficult, this was the kind of problem that sent even seasoned mathematicians into a cold sweat. She turned, smirking as she tapped the marker against the board. "Go ahead," she said, arms crossed. "Show us how it's done. Unless, of course, you'd rather sit down and keep talking about things you don't understand." The words stung, and the challenge was clear: humiliation or victory. The class held its breath, waiting for the inevitable embarrassment. But Barron didn't flinch. He stood up, calm as ever, and walked toward the board. His expression was unreadable, his movements steady. Dr. Markham's smirk widened. This was going to be good. She had deliberately chosen this problem, knowing full well that it required methods far beyond anything taught in the course. There was no way he could pull this off. Then Barron spoke, his voice even and controlled. "Before I begin, I'd like to point out that this problem has more than one approach. Would you prefer I use the standard method or a more efficient solution based on original work by Leibniz?" The room fell silent. Even she hesitated for a moment. "You've read Leibniz's original work?" she asked, the confidence in her voice faltering slightly. "Yes, in the original German. The translations lose some of the finer details." Barron didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The message was clear. This wasn't a bluff. He knew exactly what he was doing. He turned back to the board and without hesitation began to write. His movements were precise, his steps deliberate. The problem that had looked insurmountable moments ago now seemed to unravel under his pen. It wasn't just that he was solving it, he was explaining every step as he went, making it look almost effortless. The class watched in stunned silence, phones slowly being raised to record what was quickly becoming something more than just a math lesson. This first step, Barron continued, was first introduced by Euler in the 1700s. It simplifies what appears to be a complicated integral into something much more manageable. His hand moved across the board, the solution unfolding like a perfectly orchestrated plan. Even students who had struggled with basic calculus before found themselves following along. Dr. Markham, arms still crossed, leaned slightly forward, her eyes darting between the board and Barron's face. She was trying to find a flaw, some mistake she could call out, but none appeared. Barron wasn't just solving the problem, he was teaching it in a way that made more sense than any lecture she had ever given. "Now," he said, nearing the final steps, "we have two ways to proceed. The traditional method would take up another full board, but there's a more elegant approach using a lesser-known principle from Leibniz's notes." He turned to face her. "Which would you prefer?" Her expression was unreadable, her earlier smugness completely gone. The class, still recording, waited for her response. But before she could speak, another voice cut through the silence. "Could we see both?" It was Sarah Chin, one of the quieter students, her voice hesitant but firm. "This actually makes more sense than how it was explained in the textbook." Barron smiled, nodding. "Of course." He turned back to the board and continued. She remained silent, watching as the student she had intended to embarrass took complete control of her classroom. The weight of the moment hung in the air. This wasn't just about solving an equation, it was about proving a point. By the time Barron finished, the entire board was filled, but his work was as clear and clean as a textbook example. He set the marker down and turned back to the class. "And that," he said simply, "is how it's done." The silence stretched for a long moment. Then slowly, a few students began to clap. It wasn't loud at first, but it grew. The energy in the room shifted. Phones were still raised, capturing every moment. The classroom debate had already changed everything, but when Dean Richardson walked in, things took an even bigger turn. A professor's authority put to the test. The classroom door burst open with a loud bang, and in stormed Dean Richardson, a close supporter of her political stances. He barely took a breath before announcing, "Linda, we need you for an emergency faculty meeting. It's about the curriculum changes." The timing was absolutely terrible, or perhaps perfect depending on how one looked at it. She turned to her students, attempting to wrap up the session. "We'll continue this demonstration another time," she said, trying to maintain authority, but before she could take a step, Barron spoke up. "Professor, you gave me a public challenge. You asked me to solve this in front of everyone," Barron said, his voice steady but firm. His words sent a wave of murmurs through the class, and even the dean hesitated. Leaving now wouldn't set the right example about academic integrity, would it? Silence fell over the room like a heavy curtain. Dean Richardson's expression darkened, his mouth tightening as if preparing for a scolding. "Young man, are you implying—" "I'm not implying anything, sir," Barron cut in, polite but unwavering. "I'm simply stating that Dr. Markham wanted to make a point about privilege and merit, and I accepted the challenge. The only question is, will she follow through?" The weight of the moment was undeniable. Some students had their phones out, capturing what was clearly turning into something bigger than a classroom debate. She glanced at the marker in her hand, then at the equation on the board, the same problem she had picked to supposedly expose a lack of ability. But now it was her own competence under the microscope. The dean, who had arrived as an authority figure, now found himself just another spectator. The tension grew unbearable. Barron, in a move that left everyone breathless, held the marker out to Dr. Markham. "Or perhaps," he said, a quiet challenge in his tone, "you'd prefer to solve it first. After all, you've made it clear that knowledge is what really matters. As our professor, surely you can walk us through the solution?" The classroom fell into a stunned silence. Her fingers tightened around the marker as if it had suddenly turned to lead. Her mind raced. How had this happened? How had the moment she designed to humiliate one student flipped into an interrogation of her own knowledge? The presence of the dean wasn't a shield anymore. It was a witness, a judge. Phones stayed lifted, capturing every moment. She started, then faltered. Her eyes darted to the board. The equation wasn't impossible, but under this kind of scrutiny, every second felt like a lifetime. Barron, unshaken, extended an olive branch. "We could solve it together. Collaboration often leads to better understanding." There was no mockery in his tone, no arrogance, just a genuine offer. But that made it even worse. Dr. Markham's pride wouldn't allow her to take it. Her jaw clenched. "This is absurd," she snapped, tossing the marker onto the desk. "This entire stunt is nothing but a privileged student trying to undermine my authority." The class collectively exhaled, but the moment of tension didn't dissolve. It shifted. Now it was Barron's turn to pick up the pieces, or rather the marker. He bent down, retrieved it, and met Dr. Markham's fiery gaze with cool determination. "No," he said, voice unwavering, "this is about moving forward." And then, without another word, he turned to the board and did something that would leave the room breathless. In less than 5 minutes, he completed both solutions, the traditional method and an alternative approach. His movements were quick, precise, and completely unshaken. As he wrote the final number, the class exploded into applause. Even the dean couldn't hide his astonishment. But this wasn't the moment that would change everything. That came next. Dr. Markham stood there, her face drained of color, her carefully built reputation starting to crumble. Barron wasn't finished, though. He stepped back, facing both his professor and the dean. "Mathematics doesn't care about politics, backgrounds, or biases," he stated, gesturing at the board. "It only cares about truth. And when we let personal agendas cloud our judgment, we miss the opportunity to grow. The dean cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. Mr. Trump, while your mathematical abilities are impressive, you must understand that... Before he could finish, a voice rang from the back of the room. That what? It was Michael Chin, a quiet scholarship student who rarely spoke. That we should learn less math because of someone's political beliefs? The words cut through the air like a blade. And just like that, the classroom, the faculty, and the institution itself were forced to face a new reality. One where knowledge, not authority, would decide who held the real power. What started as a classroom argument didn't stay in the room for long. Soon, more people heard about it, and the whole school was watching. One lesson that redefined the classroom. Dr. Markham's class was supposed to be about calculus, but instead it had turned into something else entirely. Students were getting frustrated. One stood up and said they came here to learn math, not to get a lecture about privilege. Others nodded, their patience running out. The air in the room was thick with tension, and for a moment it seemed like Dr. Markham was losing control of the class. Then a student did something unexpected. He spoke up, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the noise. He acknowledged that Dr. Markham knew a lot about math, but maybe they should stick to that instead of these other discussions. He even offered to help other students outside of class, blending theory with real problem solving. It was a lifeline, a way for Dr. Markham to keep control without backing down completely. The room fell silent, waiting to see what she would do. Dr. Markham hesitated. Her whole approach had been about challenging privilege and making students think about more than just numbers. But now, faced with the reality of their frustration, she had to make a choice. Slowly, she admitted she had been wrong. She had spent too much time focusing on one issue and had ignored what she was actually there to teach. The shift was subtle, but it changed everything. For the first time, she really saw her students for who they were, not just who she assumed they were. Then came the real shock. Students outside the class had started gathering. Word had spread fast. People were watching the drama unfold in real time, posting videos and reactions online. Soon, a crowd formed outside, holding signs with phrases like "Teach math, not politics," and "Merit over bias." The situation was about to explode into something much bigger than just a classroom debate. But the student who had spoken up wasn't done yet. Instead of letting things spiral, he walked to the door and spoke to the crowd. If they were here to learn, they should come inside. And just like that, students poured in, filling every seat and standing along the walls. Dr. Markham watched, stunned. She had been struggling to keep students engaged, and now, thanks to him, the room was packed with eager learners. What happened next became legend. He took the marker and turned the class back to what it was supposed to be: math. For the next hour, students listened, asked questions, and actually learned something useful. It wasn't about privilege or politics anymore. It was about numbers, equations, and real-world applications. And for the first time in a long time, Dr. Markham felt like she was truly teaching. The story spread across campus like wildfire. People expected it to be about a professor getting humiliated, but instead it became something else. Enrollment in advanced calculus skyrocketed. Dr. Markham, humbled by the experience, changed her approach. She went back to focusing on what she loved, teaching math. The student who had spoken up, true to his word, led study sessions and helped others bridge the gap between theory and practice. Was this professor trying to teach math, or was she using her position to push an agenda? And did she ever expect Barron Trump to outshine her so easily? Tell us what you think, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.